come briefly out from behind the fog of my mask, speak to you, put my mask back on, and then the author will come up. Because we're so far away, maybe it's good social distancing that the front row is not packed full. The speaker will move forward without a mask. It will also make it so much easier for her to speak and easier for us to hear. So there's the upside there. My name is Nancy White. I'm director of the Writers Project here at SUNY Adirondack. This is my last year. So I'm savoring every one of these readings as we slide into 2022, and this is our last reading for the semester. I feel like it's a wonderful place for us to conclude, especially for the students in English 180, where we look at, think about the writers who are visiting and what we learned from them, not just about writing, but about the writing life. I think this is a great event for us to land on. You're going to relate to, I think, many of the themes in Khristeena's novel that she'll be talking about, and I think reading some sections of today, because it's very much about people struggling to get where they want to go against the obstacles around them, social, political, historical, personal, and it makes the two points of view from 100 years ago, antebellum Southern woman trying to figure out what to do with her life, and contemporary first generation academic trying to make the life she's been dreaming of happen. And the themes span those centuries, and they also unite the two characters. And I think you will feel that same connection to them, that the main character, I'll call her the main character, even though Grace is also a main character. The main character, Meredith, is feeling when she looks back and studies this much earlier woman, Grace King. But let me tell you just a little bit about Khristeena before we launch into looking at this creation of hers. She is a professor here at SUNY Adirondack, if you didn't already know that. She'd love to spend as much time as possible outdoors, so this is just the right place for her to teach. She should never leave. Running, hiking, camping, horseback riding, got to add that to the list here. And she's the director of the Center for Reading and Writing, so you may have crossed paths with her there as well. She started out earning her Bachelor of Arts in English from Ohio University. Was it the really huge one?
That's Ohio State.
Oh, that's Ohio State, okay. Because they're so big, it's like, you know, what, 20 Queensburys? That's one college, yeah. And then was a junior high teacher for a while in Yuma, Arizona. Then she worked on a Master of Arts degree in elementary education from Northern Arizona University, just as the Army shipped her whole family across the country to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where she later finished both a Master of Arts in English from Austin Peay State University and a doctorate in English from Middle Tennessee State University. So that's a lot of schools and quite a few degrees. And if you know Khristeena, you know that she did them full bore, 1000%, and probably didn't sleep a lot during that time. Yeah, her specialty, and you'll see this coming out in the creative work, is American women writers from the Civil War, in particular, to the present. One of her reviewers says, let me get the words just right, so I'm going to read it off the screen here. Finding Grace and Grit, that's the title of the book, touches upon the ways ambitious women throughout history must navigate their particular societal norms and challenges to reach their highest potential, and bestows the reader with the parallel lives of two female characters who, in the face of financial ruin, familial trials and heartbreak, professional triumphs and adversities, find their way to their best selves. So among many other things you'll find in her work, I think is inspiration for, times of the semester when you feel like you can't go on and you're not going to make it, and we were just talking about this in class, Melissa, because these characters very much do. So, Khristeena, would you please take the stage? Mask and just, whew, there it is. It's like taking it off at the end of the day. All right. My podium is a little short, so when you see me kind of squint, just bear with me, okay? First, thank you, Nancy, so much, not just for the invitation to speak, the lovely introduction. It's always a little bit odd to hear your accomplishments listed, like somehow they're yours and not yours at the exact same time. Like somebody else did those things. That wasn't me. And then as you listen to it, you're like, oh, yeah, okay, I did do those things. Yeah, I just kind of didn't think about it in the same way. This is a really odd platform for me. I normally have a really clear distinction in my audiences. They are either purely academic, where I am precise, poised, practiced, I have a perfect script, and I have a very specific formula I'm supposed to follow for academic conferences. I also have some folks that are purely collegial, where I'm really, really quiet and introverted, and frankly, they may have already heard me speak more today than ever, and it's been a minute. So very, very introverted when I'm with my fellow colleagues. But I'm also working with other writers. You may not have heard my voice a whole lot at all. As writers, we're supposed to utilize lots and lots of social media. I hate social media. I hate videos, I hate clips, I hate TikTok, Reels, all of it. All of it. I'm only listening to them. I keep them muted. I will watch a reel. I want to listen to it. The world is noisy enough. I want it to be. I was a very big fan of No Noise November. Just everybody shut up. I like the quiet. But my main audience is actually students who have, in all honesty, probably seen the most authentic version of me, particularly of these groups. For my students, I can relax, I can make dumb jokes, I can cuss a lot. Just as an FYI, nothing will bond you faster with freshmen than just a rhetorically placed fuck every now and then. They think it's fantastic. Immediate bonding, we're good. That's all about knowing your audience, my students, right? We go back to the rhetorical triangle. We have to come back to that constantly. Today, though, I get to have every INFJ's worst nightmare. I have all of those groups in one audience. And it's being recorded, which is extra fantastic for me. It's awesome. So a while back, when I finished my doctorate, I landed my tenure-track job in a lovely area of the country. I moved my whole family a third of the way across the country. I'll leave out the various side stories here, like the cat climbing the inside of the truck, peeing on all of us in her terror. I got the fact that she, in her normal right, is a very vicious predator, and she's good. She's terrified of car rides. Cut her some slack. I helped my kids to start new schools. They started new lives. They found new friends. They joined new friend groups. But in all of that, I had kind of screwed something up. Something was missing for me. I spent all that effort making sure everybody else was going to transition okay. Forgot to take care of myself, which is what a lot of moms do. So something wasn't right. There was something else that I was supposed to do, but for the life of me, I could not figure out what. Kind of like that feeling like you've left the stove on, but it's just a lot bigger. You just feel like there's this naggy little thing, and you feel its presence, it's right there, but you can't quite see it, and every time you try to look, it disappears. It's gone again. It takes a little while. At the end of my first year as a professor, I didn't feel right, but I kept up with my professional duties. I kept up with coursework. I kept up with all the things I needed to do. That July, I went to an international literary conference. It was being held in Bordeaux. It's very pricey, it's very beautiful. I want you all to know that in France, in Bordeaux, in July, there's no air conditioning. You melt. You melt. It's very, very warm. But I went, and I presented on Grace King's writing, actually. I love going to conferences because I get to have a little bit of distance and space to just think. There are no dishes calling for me to come do them. There's not one of my kids waiting for me to help them with their homework. There's no grading line waiting and waiting and waiting and weighing on my soul. Just, you're kind of apart from all that. So I spent some time just kind of wandering down these little cobblestone roads, just trying to figure out whatever that
something was, that naggy little thing that was back there, that thing that I was missing. I thought, well, I could try to write again. That had been a long time, but what would I even write about? You know, I had nothing. I was completely exhausted. I had a little bit of academia burnout. And then as I was walking through those little streets, it finally just kind of clicked. I was there to talk about grace. I've been writing and presenting on King for so many years. I could write about her. And then that made perfect sense for me. That's a thing I know. That's a thing I'm familiar with. Up until that moment, I had always viewed my academic self as completely separate from my creative self. Why? Couldn't one directly feed and sculpt the other? I came across this little cafe, grabbed a little table, ordered a Heineken, and got to work, just right there on the spot. I approached the project from an academic perspective. I set a major project goal, big word count. Then I started creating dozens of little steps to get me there, just as I had done with my dissertation and every other large-scale project before that. I approached it with a very analytical mindset. I'm going to take this big thing and I'm going to break it down into very tiny little pieces that I can actually put into my calendar and do. I framed those first goals just around Grace. I didn't even expand it out. Meredith wasn't there just yet, but she came in shortly after. And the more so those stories started to form, the more they started to connect across the chapters. The pieces just started to kind of click. So once I returned home, I really let that academic brain just completely direct the project. For academics, you're trained analysts. We will analyze everything. We should come to a faculty meeting sometime. We will analyze what a faculty meeting really should be for about 45 minutes. We'll analyze anything. We'll break it down into tiny little pieces, and we will discuss it just at great depth and length. But what would happen if I turned that kind of a mindset onto the story that I wanted to write? What would I do with that? So I set up my Scrivener. That's the writing software that I prefer to use. I put in all of my goals, my word count goals. I checked off my little writing days to see exactly how many words do I need to write in every single session if I want to hit my goal by this date. I wrote in the mornings. Usually I try to write before the kids even get up for the bus. That's gotten a lot harder now that they have to get up so early, but try to get some of that out before my actual day even starts. And then in the afternoons and evenings, I started rereading every historical reference I had on King, and then ordered some more. I contacted libraries all over the country for this, that, or the other. They would find me microfiche that hadn't been pulled out of the stacks or the archives in decades. At one point, the items that I requested, I received a very kind email from a librarian who apologizes very deeply, but we are having a hurricane right now, and we aren't there. So we're going to get back to you on Monday. She's like, okay, I think we need to reconsider those priorities, but okay, thank you. And I swear to goodness, Tuesday, there come my PDFs. Oh my gosh. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, exactly. They're academics. So I approached my writing in that very same way that I had approached that doctoral dissertation. Slow, methodical research. I would read one chapter or small section on half a dozen different books, and then I would cross-reference them, each and every one of them. I would consider each source's value and contributions in exactly the same way that I tell my students to do with their sources. What does this book add to my narrative? What does this particular story reveal to me that I didn't know before? Is there a teeny tiny little seed of a detail out of this piece that I need to bring over? I started with basic biography. I read a section. I go to Grace's own memoirs. I think I have a couple copies of that one down there. I actually found a first edition, but you know, the first editions, you can't write on those, you can't annotate, they're too pretty, they're special. So I had to order like the crap version from Amazon, because they're reprints. If you've ever ordered reprints from Amazon, 50% of the time it's not even the book you ordered once you get it. It's got that cover on it, but when you open it, what's this? It's not even close. So I have a couple of those versions too. So I would cross-reference these things, and I would think, well, how does Grace remember that particular event? How are her memoirs different from her journals, as they do in many, many places? We get different levels of information in different cases there. What did she write in this particular source that's different from that one? But maybe she also wrote a letter to someone with more information about that, because she's a very prolific letter writer. In fact, Mark Twain House in Hartford, it's Grace King's letters that they are using to do their tours. When they walk people through and they describe a very particular dinner party that was held right there in the Twain House, they're using Grace's letters because she gave such a distinct and precise recollection of that particular meal. She used to write all these really long letters back home to her mother because they would want to know all of the details about an event so that they could pick and choose what they would want to do for their own events. So it was also like, you know, a little home and gardening. What do they serve? Ooh, olives, that's expensive. What else do they serve? Salted almonds. Ooh, okay. And they would try to copy a little bit, so they thought that was helpful for them. Then, after I would do all of these things with various biographical pieces of information, I would do it again. Again. I would take more notes. I would take more notes. I would add annotations. I would add highlights in different colors for different situations. I would add even more notes. And eventually, I added in reading her fictional works while rereading the biographical pieces. And as I did that, I started to see little bits and pieces of her there in the fiction. Grace and her life, just showing up in her short stories. Just little tiny pieces, tucked everywhere, just like the way writers do, without even realizing it. We put little pieces of ourselves in these different situations. I was starting to see those connections for her. And I go, oh, okay, I can see why you would have been focused on that topic at that time of your life. Or, okay, I see now why the sisters were really angry at their brother in that particular short story, because I can see what was happening in Grace's real life to see how this was affecting the writing. And in doing this, a clearer image of Grace the person began to emerge. She's extremely stubborn, she's persistent, and she's a little arrogant. She pretends like she's not. She has this very false, humble thing. No, on the inside, she's extremely arrogant. And at the same time, she's shy and nervous, and she's terrified of speaking in front of audiences. That was something that persisted her entire life. She would be absolutely terrified. So for example, I'm going to look at Grace's first venture into public speaking. Here we go. Grace stood in the front parlor of the weekly Penn Gnostics meeting, wringing her hands nervously and trying not to blot her papers. Members poured in and filled the rows of seats, chatting warmly with each other. Grace anxiously adjusted her skirts, a dark navy, to set the tone of serious intellect that she wanted to convey. Miss King, asked Mrs. Howe, gently taking her elbow, how are you, my dear? You needn't be nervous, I promise, she added in a whisper. Grace smiled as confidently as she could manage and started to speak. Mrs. Howe, however, took her elbow more firmly and steered them both into a quiet corner. I remember my first time speaking to an audience, she said. I was terrified, she admitted. Suddenly, Grace liked Mrs. Howe just a little bit more than she had just a minute ago. I was so nervous, my hands crushed my papers, and I had to give half my speech from memory. And yet, Mrs. Howe paused dramatically. I absolutely loved it. It was such a thrill, she said, laughing quietly. I knew right then and there that I was supposed to be a speaker, a person to represent others and help get their voices heard too. That's why I'm here, remember, to get women's voices heard. Your voice deserves to be heard, Grace. You are an uncommonly intelligent woman, and your ideas are well-founded and interesting. Now go up there, read your words, and share that part of you with this audience. Grace smiled and nodded, momentarily speechless at Mrs. Howe's kindness. She suddenly felt a tiny bit guilty for her snark and bite towards the house and the women's department in general. Now let me introduce you, my dear, Mrs. Howe said, walking to the narrow wooden podium at one end of the parlor. Welcome all, her voice suddenly boomed across the room. People scurried into seats, and the women waved small fans, which created a gentle fluttering around the room. Today's speaker is the lovely Miss Grace King, who will speak about the most interesting topic of the American heroine. The audience clapped politely as Mrs. Howe and Grace traded positions. She arranged her papers on the podium and licked her lips. Her heart pounded in her chest and threatened to drown out her small voice. She felt weak and tiny and shifted her weight from foot to foot. Forgive me, she said with an embarrassed smile. A gentle wave of smiles swept across the room, and Grace slowly drew in an even breath, casting her eyes down at her paper. The word words swam in blurry black marks, and she stared at them, willing the room to disappear into the walls around her. She remembered suddenly her father's voice. "Speak up, sissy. Make yourself heard in the back of the room." Mrs. Howe's words also came to her. "I'm here to make women like you heard. Speak up." Suddenly, a quiet sense of confidence settled into her chest. She began to read. 20 minutes later, she was startled to hear applause. She had focused so heartily on reading her speech that she hadn't heard her own voice. Grace couldn't remember a thing, but the audience smiled, nodded, and clapped. She breathed a sigh of relief and walked away from the podium. A crowd of well-wishers gathered to congratulate her on the essay, and she felt such a wonderful buzzing in her heart. Pride? Happiness? Whatever it was new, and she recognized that a weaker Grace had stepped up to the podium, but a new, stronger Grace had stepped down from it. Grace, throughout her life, continues to battle extreme stage fright. She deals with it for a little while when she goes to Paris, when she lives there off and on through the 1890s. Just the entire academic atmosphere, environment, a little bit different with the gender disparity, and she felt a lot more comfortable there, a little bit more at home. Sorry, y'all, I lost my track. There we go. Notes. My people who are nervous in public speaking, notes. Make the font bigger so when you're nervous you can see what you're doing, okay? For a while I was ticking off where I was. I stopped doing that. Tricked myself. So after beginning to see Grace's own progression towards becoming a writer, I wanted then to juxtapose Meredith's own path to becoming a scholar and writer about a century or so later. Some things had changed, but some things really had not that much. I especially enjoyed fictionalizing an actual talk I gave in New Orleans in the following scene. I like to pair these whenever I do some readings because it's very interesting to compare the two scenes. Here we are. So in New Orleans, in the French Quarter, there is, in all actuality, it still exists today, Le Petit Salon. If you are going down St. Peter, it's right beside the cathedral, just to the right. There's a building with these very famous spiral wrought iron staircase. That's the salon. It's completely private. There is no website. There's no list of members. There's nothing. They don't even allow pictures to be taken of the inside. You are never to film there. No, nothing can happen once you walk through the door. They are very, very private. And it's always been so. They have done that for decades, purely because they wanted the women who were members to have complete privacy and a sense of safety to ask questions, to share knowledge, and to work together without having any of that publicized anywhere. It also started in the era where you had a lot of women who didn't have the opportunity to go to college, and they still wanted to learn, they wanted to experience these different academic subjects, but you know, when you're 40 or 50, or at that point even 30, they didn't have that chance. So they wanted to do that. They wanted to have this extra space. The Petit Salon still exists, and they do send out private invitations on occasion to invite folks in. The year that I was there, it was the 90th anniversary, and Grace King was their first president. She helped to put the club together. So it was kind of an honor, and I really enjoyed fictionalizing that speech that I gave for them. So, here we go. The next morning was the day of the presentation, and Meredith sipped on her too hot ginger tea as she walked around St. Louis Cathedral in a light, misty rain. She was too nervous to sit anywhere, so she walked and sipped. Walked and sipped. The morning was gray and unseasonably cold. A light drizzle came down, the air heavy for November. She glanced at her phone obsessively. Finally, it was time to go to the salon to give her lecture. She made her way slowly back around the cathedral and up St. Peter. On the left rested the salon, with its iconic spiral wrought iron staircase behind locked gates. A bottom floor door was open. She cautiously entered the dark stone walkway and followed it to the courtyard entrance. In the courtyard, the rain came a little heavier and the light fog misted the cobblestones. She looked around carefully, fully expecting someone to pop out and challenge her being there. But the place seemed empty and quiet. It was nice to poke around a bit without needing to be social at the same time. Parallel to the stone entryway, the rectangular presentation gallery sat across from the courtyard entrance. She stepped in and began to look around at the books in the barrister bookcases. walls advertising this person's book release or that person's art opening. The wood floors creaked as she made her way down the center aisle up to the wooden podium. All computer hookups had been tucked inside, so it still had the look of an antique wooden platform. The projection screen was already pulled down and ready. "Good morning," called a friendly, warm voice from the doorway. The current president embodied the image of the Southern lady with a capital L. Mrs. Allen's mauve skirt suit was impeccable, and Meredith found herself double-checking her own black dress and boots. Her camel-colored boots were a bit worn and were comfortable, were beginning to show some serious mileage. "We are just so glad you're here," Mrs. Allen gushed, opening her arms for a light embrace. "Are you finding everything you need? You help yourself to all that tech, and if we need to get our guy in here to fix anything, we'll do that." Meredith smiled warmly. "I think I'll be just fine. Is it okay if I go ahead and set up?" "Absolutely. Let me get you some water to keep up there, too," Mrs. Allen said as she swept back out of the room just as she swept into it, with distinctly Southern style. Southern women anchor their worlds, moving with their own gravitational forces everywhere they go, like an extended, magnolia-scented aura. When someone is in a Southern woman's world, they know it. They are that woman's closest confidant, and they share a deep and meaningful connection. When she leaves the room, she takes her world with her, and the room is somehow emptier for having lost her. Meredith smiled gently and turned to setting up. She adjusted her laptop, plugging in various cables. Everything was working fine, so she stood near the podium as ladies began filling the seats. I should have mentioned the salon is women only. And the audiences. In fact, even the serving staff, everybody that is working in the building during their actual meetings, women only. Meredith smiled shyly in return as they smiled their own greetings, taking their seats. She had thought and feared that the cold weather would lower the crowd size, and so she expected maybe 20 people if she was lucky. The room kept filling. Each row was elbow to elbow, every seat filled. She tried to count the rows and seats and figured that almost 60 people had filled that salon. She tried to swallow the thick lump in her throat. The former president, Mrs. Winston, stood to introduce her. She listed Meredith's recent accomplishments, which sounded much too grand to her own ear. This must belong to someone else, she thought, as she took her place at the podium. "Thank you so much for inviting me here today," Meredith began. She explained that she was not originally from New Orleans, but that she'd always felt at home here. Several ladies smiled warmly and nodded their heads in agreement, their feathered hats tipping back and forth. Then Meredith fired up her first slide. She'd arranged the lecture as a literary intro to Grace King, but for a general audience. As she began telling of King's most harrowing stories, the family's escape from New Orleans during Yankee occupation, she watched the faces of her audience. They were not only listening, they were enthralled. They reached the part where the family was stuck, alone and lost in the swamps, and how the children hugged around the grandmother's knees for comfort and warmth, but that King's mother, Sarah Miller, stood and shouted for help until her voice gave out. The air in the room around Meredith was tense. When she described their rescue by a stranger and how they stepped out of the boat onto land to find King's father, waiting anxiously for them, several of the ladies gasped and fanned themselves. The most rewarding storytelling moment Meredith ever had. As she transitioned into the next section of her lecture, she saw an elderly man being escorted to a front seat. The man is being seated here is important, she thought. Relative? She quickly decided to drop Grace's utter hatred of the drinking habits of her brothers, as this man had to be related to one of them, since none of Grace's sisters had ever had any children. She continued on with her lecture and noticed a striking woman halfway back and right in the middle of the left-hand section. Other women sat with slightly curved backs, slumped ever so slightly into their chairs. This woman sat with a rigid spine, her face tilted up. Her eyes were dark, and light gray hair short and curly. Many of the ladies were dressed for style in their skirt suits with corsages. This woman was dressed for function in a simple button-down shirt. She made direct eye contact the entire lecture, smiling warmly when Meredith looked directly back at her. As Meredith spoke, she realized she had begun presenting to this one woman, this one avid listener. When she finished, the audience clapped warmly, but her heart was still pounding in her ears, so she barely heard any of it. The woman in the audience held her hands at chest height so Meredith could see. She clapped and gave a deep, singular nod and smiled. Immediately, Meredith was presented with a small group of ladies shaking her hand, congratulating her, offering business cards. She was then ushered upstairs to the parlor for tea and a beautiful reception. The room was decorated with antique furniture under a beautiful crystal chandelier. A piano stood in one corner, and people collected in small pockets throughout the room. Meredith was socially exhausted, but she smiled and thanked each one as they came up to speak to her. She had hoped to meet the woman from downstairs, but she seemed to have disappeared completely. Before long, Mrs. Allen approached. "There's someone I'd like to introduce to you." She escorted Meredith to the piano, where the gentleman from earlier sat on the bench. "Meredith, this is Mr. King." The elderly man stretched out his hand to take hers. "Young lady, you did a wonderful job," he said. "I'm Fred's grandson, Grace's great-nephew." "Oh, wow," Meredith said. "It's so very nice to meet you." "I was a very young boy when Grace was still alive," he said. Mrs. Allen walked away to give them a few minutes alone. "She and the sisters were still living in the big house then, you know." Meredith smiled kindly and nodded. "The beautiful home up on Coliseum by the park," she said. "That's the one. I used to play under the table in the dining room. We would visit with the sisters every so often, not too much. I couldn't have been but 5 or 6 years old." "Do you remember anything about Grace?" "Not much, I'm afraid." She wanted to ask him all sorts of questions, but she also recognized that he probably wouldn't be able to answer them, since he'd been so young when Grace was alive. "What kind of auntie was she?" Meredith finally asked. "The kind that complained when you ran down the halls making too much noise, or the kind that snuck you cookies before dinner?" She grinned and chuckled. "A little bit of both, I suppose," he answered, depending on the occasion. His wife appeared and introduced herself. "I'm afraid we really must be going, but your talk was wonderful." "Thank you. I'm so glad to have met you both," Meredith said, smiling. His wife helped Mr. King stand and continued to steady his arm as they made their way out of the room. The crowd was beginning to thin, and Meredith found she could relax just a little bit. She wandered back into the front parlor, near the piano again. Across from it stood a beautiful painting of Grace King. She knew from research that this one was done from a live sitting. "Well, Grace, I think I'm getting closer to something, but I still have no idea what I'm doing," Meredith said softly, so no one else could hear. "Any grand wisdom or secrets to share?" Grace just stared back from the painting, silent. So as I started reflecting over Meredith's past and her struggles, I naturally kept coming back to Grace's, vice versa. The thing is, we often think that the past and times in history were just easier or simpler, but it's blatantly not true. It's easier to do the dishes, yeah. It's a lot easier to do some household chores, yes. Things like drug addiction and family complications, it's just the same. It still occurred, and a lot more frequently than I think many students, especially undergrads, would think. Families weren't perfectly nuclear families. They were complicated and messy, exactly like they are now. Grace's youngest brother, Will, actually experienced immense hardship, and the family debated for decades what might or might not have saved him. This particular moment was burned into Grace's memory for the rest of her life. Grace fanned herself on the back gallery, trying to escape some of the heavy heat of the early evening. Inside the back door, she heard Will and Mimi chatting. "Will, you look terrible," Mimi said, her voice heavy with concern. Grace rolled her eyes. "Sure he does," she thought. "Grace," Mimi called. Grace sighed deeply as she climbed to her feet, which were a bit sore after a busy day of cleaning the house. She walked inside to see Will sitting at the kitchen table, his face and neck crimson and irritated. Sweat trickled down his forehead. Mimi carried a large bowl filled with cool water and a damp cloth. She set the bowl on the table and began blotting the cloth over Will's head, reminding Grace of the many times she did the same thing during their childhood fevers. Mimi's hands trembled now with age as she attempted to care for her grown son. Her frown and concern were set deeply in her face. For a moment, she watched the scene. Elderly mother tending to her son, Jean Grace thought, until she focused on the grown man sitting in the chair smelling heavily of bourbon. Suddenly, Grace felt her temper rising. "Nothing," Grace said. "He's clearly just drunk, again." "Grace," Mimi said, her voice conveying decades of exhaustion and fatigue in a single word. Will looked up at Grace tears in his eyes. Though his forehead was still bright red, his lips were almost white. She's right, Mimi, he mumbled, still looking into Grace's eyes. Grace could hear tears forming in the storm of his eyes. I'm not worth it. He tried to stand but stumbled and fell into Mimi's shoulder. I'll go rest, Maman. He rebalanced himself, kissed Mimi's forehead, and walked slowly from the room. Mimi watched him go without protesting, and Grace listened to the stairs creak as he climbed them before she met her mother's eyes. And when she did, Mimi was livid. Dear, she kissed. Can't you see he's had a sunstroke? He isn't drunk, not this time. Mimi, he smells like bourbon, Grace insisted, trying to defend herself. And even if he was drunk, which he is not, can't you get it through your stubborn head that he has a problem? Mimi dumped the water from the bowl into the sink. Grace looked up at the stairs where Will had gone. He was acting a little more oddly than usual, she thought. Finally, she sighed. Okay, Mimi, I'm sorry. What can I do? Should I go for the doctor? No, Mimi said, sniffling. He needs something just to calm his nerves. Just go to Mr. Amon's next door. Grace nodded and left. Within minutes, she returned with a sedative for Will, which Mimi immediately took to him while the rest of the family had a quiet dinner downstairs. The pressure of a coming storm weighed heavily on them all. In the middle of the night, Grace woke at the sound of thunder shaking the walls of the house. She and Mimi ran around, closing the windows against the pouring rain. They entered Will's room and closed his window, while he slept through the storm, not even stirring while they were in his room. The next morning, Grace rose to make coffee, her usual routine. Mimi joined her. The silence was still heavy between them. I'm going to check on him, Mimi said. Of course, Mama, Grace said, trying to be the dutiful child. Mimi returned almost immediately. His water closet door was shut. He must be up then. They sat at the table, sipping their hot, sweet chicory coffee. Mama, Grace said finally, I'm sorry. I just see how tired you are from caring for him. I will never tire of caring for my children, Mimi said, holding her head high. Grace could still see her mother as the Southern belle. Straight back, graceful tilt of her head, and a neck like a dancer's. But she had aged with so much stress, strife, and worry in her life. Dark circles were now permanently affixed to her mother's face, as were the heavy lines around her mouth and her always sad eyes. It's been too long. He should be coming down for work. Grace walked into the back gallery, enjoying the small breeze of damp air. Grace, Nan called from the stairs. Come help. Will's locked the water closet door and won't answer. Grace sighed, pressed her lips shut. With this drama ever end? The constant fights, the yelling, and tears had added weight to all of their shoulders. She tried to keep her temper in check as she walked up the stairs, not hearing Mimi's voice in the distance calling and begging Will to open the door. A lump of frustration tightened in Grace's throat. That was enough, Grace half sobbed as she reached the top of the stairs. She joined Nan and Mimi and pounded on the door with them. Nina and Branch were out of town, so the three women beat their hands on the door, not knowing what else to do. No answer came. William King, we've had enough of your nonsense, Grace screamed, kicking the wooden door. It's too much. You're too much for us to keep putting up with this. I'll have this door broken down, William. Open it. You scared Mimi for the last time, I tell you. Grace curled her hands into fists and began waylaying, turning her knuckles red. Mimi and Nan stepped back. When Branch gets home, we will send you away, Grace screamed. We don't deserve this. It isn't fair. Open this door and face your responsibilities. Grow up. Grace beat her fist until several of the knuckles turned bloody. Angry tears stung her eyes until she couldn't see the door anymore, and she leaned her face against it, sobbing. And then a mild smell reached her nose. Gas. She flinched when Mimi touched her elbow gently. Nan's coming with Mr. Amon's, and I've yelled for the watchman from the front gallery. They're coming up the stairs now. Grace hadn't even realized that Nan and Mimi had stepped away. Mimi's hands clutched at her heart, and she looked close to fainting. Her face was drained and paler than Grace had ever seen it. The two men rushed into the room with Nan right behind them. On three, Mr. Amon said to the watchman. 1, 2, 3. As the door gave in, Grace caught a glimpse of Will lying on the floor of the water closet, his body curled around the toilet with his face just inches from the gas pipe. Oh my God, said Mr. Ames. He turned to Grace and gestured for the ladies to leave the room. So Grace swept her arm around Mimi's back and guided her into Branch's room. What's happened? Mimi murmured, her lower lip trembling uncontrollably. Will? Will? My poor wayward Will. She began rocking herself back and forth on the edge of Branch's bed as Grace held her. You, hissed Mimi at Grace as she gasped for air. You pushed him. You threatened him. Mimi pushed Grace away violently. But Mimi, I didn't mean for, Grace said, the lump in her throat choking back any other words. She got a hand on her shoulder and looked up tearfully into Nan's soft eyes. It's okay, Sissy. I'll take care of it for now, said Nan. Grace nodded and let Nan take her place beside Mimi. She walked back into Will's room where the men had moved his body onto the bedroom floor. He lay there, twisted at a grotesque angle, leering up with his lip fixed in a snarl. Bless you. Grace took a deep breath and tried to control her tears as she arranged his arms and legs into a more restful pose before Mimi could see him. She then placed her white handkerchief gently over his face. The family debates for decades whether or not Will actively took his own life or whether it's an accident. He had just overdosed and collapsed, and there was never an answer for that. So that's what they would continue to debate was, well, what should we have done? What could we have done? What one thing could have been different? It's just, I find it interesting, that notion that we sometimes, like I said, look back upon historical figures as having much simpler lives, but they didn't. They were still complicated and messy. But understanding that other writers experience these ups and downs kind of helps me to put things in perspective. Did Grace experience a great deal of hardship and pain? Absolutely. Was she able to write through it all? No. She took long breaks from her writing, even experienced a mental breakdown. That's when she actually moved to Ruston, Louisiana, just to become a professor for a little while, just to have a break away from the family. She couldn't write through those things, those periods of her life. And if we look at historical biographies of many of the favorite authors that we have, they do the same thing. Some of them can write through trauma and they can write through stress, and others take long breaks. Which is why I say this so that we don't hold ourselves to a ridiculously tight standard that we can follow suit there. The thing is, we're all human, and a lot of us, especially those of us that are moving in different types of communities than those which we grew up in, we have a really hard time not seeing ourselves as imposters. We'll tell ourselves, I'm not a real whatever, but I will be when whatever goal it is that you've made up. We all do this, myself included. When I started college, I was on a full academic scholarship. There was no other way I've been able to do so without that scholarship. But that meant working 20 hours a week on campus for my tuition waiver. And I would work to pay the bills another 20 hours or so at a local veterinarian's office. And then I was also taking 18 credit hours a quarter. We weren't quarters. Remember quarters were fun. And taking other odd jobs. In the 4 years of my undergraduate degree, I was a veterinary assistant, but low ranking, so I got the really, really gross jobs. Like I once spent a whole afternoon just picking maggots out of an ungrateful duck. Like a really bad jobs. Okay. I was an exercise rider for various stables, but again, I was really low ranking, so I always got put on the bananas horses that you would never set foot in the stirrup iron. I was a clerk at a bookstore, I was a custodian at a department store, I was a research assistant for 2 different professors. The third one heard about my work for them, so he hired me to actually do research for an agricultural project in the Netherlands. That was kind of cool. I was a library assistant, a computer lab assistant, a boat rental seasonal worker, a restaurant hostess. Oh, and I managed an art gallery that was actually inside a former insane asylum on the nights and weekends, just to make it extra dark and scary. A lot of those jobs, I actually did 3 or 4 of them at a time. It's not like I switched jobs frequently, I was doing them all. I studied by writing papers on Post-it notes and napkins and stuffing them in my pockets. And I put them in order once I finally got home at the end of the night. I reviewed flashcards while walking dogs, keep them in my smock pocket. I listened to French lessons on my Walkman while vacuuming the clothing sections of the department store. And that's how many old I am, by the way. It's so weird. I can place the eras there. No one I knew had ever gone to college. I did not realize that working all of these jobs in a week and doing a full load of classes was not the norm. I just thought, if I want to do this, I gotta do what I gotta do. But the whole time, I waited. I waited for someone else to tell me that I was on the right path. It's not how it works. I I started with, I'll be a real scholar when I finish that 4-year degree. So I did that. No, actually, once I got there, I decided, I'll be a real scholar when I get into grad school. Okay, did that. Just don't feel like a real scholar, so maybe not. Maybe it's when I finish grad school. Turns out, nope, not then either. What about when I start my doctorate? Nope, wrong again. How about when I get the PhD? Surely that final moment of congratulations, Dr. Lute, will bring that feeling, right? Nope. All right, fine. What about when I publish the first article? Second one? Okay. I'll be a real academic and writer when I publish the first book. So sorry to tell you, especially my younger people, my undergrads here, you're not gonna suddenly gain this feeling of, oh, I'm a this now. It's just not how it works. It's significantly slower. And those of us who have been climbing up, we're constantly looking to others to tell us when we've made it. Just to tell us we're there, that we're included among them, part of that particular tribe. And it can feel really lonely. Because it's not just other people or friends that you're looking for, it's that little part of yourself. And if someone else will acknowledge that part of you, then maybe you can start to do that as well. But the thing is, it's not up to the others, it's up to us. Grace fought that exact same battle, waiting for decades for other people to acknowledge, to give her that sense of permission to be this thing, until she finally realized that it wasn't up to them to give her permission to be that thing. We have to decide that we are or are not something. A writer, an artist, a painter, doesn't matter. It's internal. It's not out there, it's in here. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk and listening to me prattle on for a while. I'm gonna rehydrate and then I'd be happy to take any questions.
Part of our Q&As before, you simply raise your hand and the author calls on you. Often if the author thinks you were extremely soft-spoken, they'll repeat your question. And this happens a lot with masks, so. Questions? All right.
How long did it take you to actually write your first book?
So that conference that I went to was in July of 2017. It took me until the end of summer of 2018 to feel like I had a draft. And then I just revised the bejesus out of it for about a year, and it didn't let anybody else even look at it. I'm very private with my writing. I'm stingy, I don't share. It's just for me. And then I sent it to one particular publishing house, queried them, and it took about a year and a half for it to actually be in print. So it's about 4 years from, oh, I have this idea, to holding it in my hand. That's a relatively short amount of time. For other people, it can be 5, 6, 7, 20. It just depends on the writer, and it depends on the particular circumstances.
I have a little follow-up. How did you pick which publisher? Because getting an acceptance first time out suggests to me you did a lot of research.
I did a social media study. The whole time that I was writing Finding Grace and Grit, I just started following all kinds of different publishing houses on Instagram, and I compared their posts. How are they treating their authors? Or is it just a pretty book next to a cup of tea, and that's it? Are they sending out like media blasts? Are they doing the author taking over the account kind of thing? How are they treating them? What kinds of things are they sharing? What kinds of images are they putting out there? And I noticed that one of the ones that I had been following, Thorncraft Publishing, they tended to be the only one that put out writing prompts that encouraged weekly journaling, that would not just share the newer authors, but they would return back to their previous authors and invite them in and then share a piece out of their works. Or it just seemed much more community-based. They also sponsored the African American History Trail through Clarksville, Tennessee, going down into Nashville. And that particular publishing house produced all of the pamphlets and guides at no cost to the organization that did that. I liked that notion of something that's giving back to the community. So I chose the publishing house that I wanted. It's not a big five, it's a very, very tiny little publishing house. But it was okay. I got to work very closely with my editor, Shanna. We worked back and forth on this particular piece, and I might be working on some other things in the future. I also worked with her on a yoga book as well. But that's how I did it. I shopped, and I chose not necessarily the publishing house that could have gotten my book out to more people, but I chose the publishing house that fit for me. I don't need to sell tons and tons of books. Like, I have a job. I'm good. I'm cool. I'm good. And from the stories that I would see from people who had some of those editors at some of the larger publishing companies, they didn't quite have that same relationship. And I value the relationship more than I value those numbers. And it's a good thing, because like, I got one of my quarterly statements in, for those of you who are starting out with writing, okay? Just as a ballpark figure for you, it's gonna be depressing, and I'm so very sorry. From one particular venue, I sold 65 books. My net gain from that sale is $12.70. Okay, you're not in it for the money. So, because I'm not in it for the money, chose the publishing house that best fit, and that's what I did. I just studied them for a while, just followed a bunch, and just to look and see what are they putting out. That helped me a lot. Yeah.
How did you find them? Just through media, or?
Yeah, through social media. And then Thorncraft also had a connection with, it was in the city where I received my Master's of Arts at Austin Peay State. So we had, like, I noticed a couple of familiar names in there. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna pay special attention to them. And then I was also watching a bunch of other small presses. Thorncraft also specializes in women writers telling women's stories. Like, that's their whole angle. They just publish women writers, mostly up the South, but it just kind of depends. I think they had someone from Boston and someone from up in Canada, I think, too. But yeah, a lot of it through social media.
How much did it cost you to actually put your book out?
It cost me nothing.
Really?
That's my contract, correct. The publishing, they took care of it. They did all of that. Yeah, I didn't get an advance. Sometimes you hear about, oh, writers who get advances. This is amazing. Good for them. I did not get an advance. Instead, however, in place of that, that's what they would have issued, the money for that actually went to paying for graphic designer and copyright issuance and things like that. So it didn't cost me anything. If people are starting out to write, if people are saying that you have to give money to have your thing published, please reevaluate your sources, okay? Go back, check their credibility, because they're...
Yeah, I'm a self-publisher. Well, I published my first book last year, and I went through the Amazon publishing thing, because that's what my dad did.
Yeah.
So
How did you like it?
It's pretty easy. It works for me because I don't really have to pay them anything to actually do it. But if I wanted to get the books myself, I have to pay a certain amount in order to actually get the physical a couple of physical copies to hand out and stuff. But it works for me.
Good, that's great.
I think, yeah.
I'm really glad you had a good experience with them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still working on my other books, but I'm gonna keep going back to them. It's just easy, and the only downside that I don't really like is that the covers are either covers I can actually get on my computer, like for my like the ones I actually did,
Sure.
or what they did, because I can't really search through the internet and say, okay, I like that one because of copyright
Yeah.
stuff. So it's a lot harder to find a cover that would work.
Gotcha.
But
this addresses one of the last things you talked about, Khristeena. Did Grace ever have a sense that she had arrived, and how do you know when you've arrived?
I think her sense of I have finally arrived was as soon as she came back from her first stint in Paris, because she was there with a lot of women scholars. She had never been around women scholars before. That was a whole new notion, and it just opened her eyes. She got back to New York, and her editor had stood her up, and just her temper, she just let it rip. Normally, like, she was very poised and, you know, very practiced in front of people, but he'd wasted a lot of her time because she had to spend money for a hotel and extra fare to be in the city, and her plan was to just, you know, get back on the boat and then head down south. And she was just furious, and she sent over some really angry letters. She made her sister Nan deliver them, and she didn't want to deliver them herself. But she also couldn't afford an assistant, so she was like, "Nan, take these letters over." So Nan went over, and she did a lot of Grace's like work for her. But yeah, at that point, she started to view her time in a different way. It was more like, I have a right to do this, and you are supposed to be here. You can't just shrug me off. I'm entitled to this. This is our contractual agreement here. At that point, they didn't get to push her around anymore. And that's also what starts to kick off a slow separation of Grace came from her northern publishers, who were part of that, what's the phrase, the gentleman publisher of the late 19th century. They were tended to be middle-aged white men who would befriend young, impressionable ladies and would become very deeply involved in their lives and shaping their careers until they would develop a personality and a voice and fight back, and then they would separate. A couple of Grace's editors fit that to a T, and that's when she started separating those particular individuals and then starting to publish through more southern publishing companies. But I can see a huge difference. As soon as she gets off that boat back from Paris, like, she's got a whole different personality that she's letting loose with. That's a good question.
So I know it's probably just happenstance that you're giving this presentation surrounded by this artwork and the themes in this gallery right now, but I just thank you for this presentation and for sharing your story, because most of the themes throughout this exhibit are about women's stories that they've been forgotten. And so you're talking about, you know, climbing for confidence and becoming a true scholar, and also Grace's story as well. I find really inspiring.
This was perfect. This was great.
Could you talk a little bit about your process for writing the two parallel stories? Obviously, Grace going in, I'm assuming, had the greater gravity because of your specialization there, but just how that unfolded and how they informed each other through the actual writing process.
Sure, yeah. So the first route, I actually took completely separate routes with them. I just did part 1, all Grace, part 2, all Meredith. And I kept their narratives completely separate. And then I just started going crazy, cutting and pasting, and putting them together. I started alternating with the timelines. And then I just set the whole hot mess aside for about, I don't know, a month or two, maybe even like a full fall semester. It's really hard for me to write during fall semester. It's just, fall semester's hard. But then I pulled it back off, because by that point I had enough of a break to forget what I'd written, if that makes sense. And then I came back at it, again, with the eyes of the academic, the lit analysis. And then I started going, okay, if I'm seeing these themes in Meredith's section, I should also be seeing them from Grace's section. And then I would go back and start reconnecting the pieces and add a scene here, put a scene there, add a little bit of imagery over here. There are a couple of little spots in the book where they're almost magical realists because the two characters see through history, they're seeing each other, but it's not labeled as that. I had a lot of fun just kind of tweaking those in so that most people wouldn't even have picked up on, oh, that's the other person in the corner of the room watching. But it was all about separating writer brain and academic brain. I always tell my tutors in the writing center, you have editor brain, you have tutor brain. These are two different functions. This one is line editing, this one is being kind and supportive and positive. My academic brain and my writer brain also go back and forth. I can be writing and doing things, or I can be analyzing it and breaking it down, and making sure it's doing the things that I want it to do, like looking at all the mechanics of it. And then almost like painting, going back in and add a little thinking, little thing there, until it's tweaked all the pieces and it looks not a damn thing like what it would start with. It's okay. And even now, like when I do readings, I'm editing, I skip whole lines, I flip words around, and I talk to my editor about it. I'm like, every time I look at it, I just see stuff I'm supposed to cut out. Like, that shouldn't even be in there. She's like, it's normal, we all do it. She's like, I've worked with poets that have literally stopped in the middle of a reading and started editing their work and then rewrite it with like a new angle to it. Okay, as long as it's not just me. That's where my academic brain and my writer brain conflict, because academic brain says you must read exactly what is on the page, and it needs to be in-text citations, and it needs to be 100% accurately reflected and all that kind of stuff. But about a blending of those different components, that really, really helped me. Can I answer anything else?
All right, well, I'm sure Khristeena will be happy to mingle at least until her next class. Thank you, everybody, for coming and for coming this semester. Thank you, Khristeena.
Thank you.
Right.